Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us here for episode 5 in our webinar series, our 6-part webinar series, P3s for Municipalities. This episode is on building expertise, advisors, resources, and challenges. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Barlow. I'm a partner at Fasken and chair at CCPPP's Municipal Engagement Advisory Group. I'll be introducing today's episode and also our speakers. But I would like to start off with a very big thank you to our sponsors for the series, Amico, BLG, EPCOR, Fasken, Graham, and Mainline. Because of their generous support, we're able to bring this content to life, and we are very grateful for them supporting the series and for you joining us. As we've said before in the series, our goal at the Council is to educate public owners and procurers on the P3 potential of their projects when and where they make sense. We recognize that P3s are not the right fit for every project, but they are a tried and tested solution that can work for many assets. And certainly at a time when government funding for infrastructure is increasingly tight, our hope and view is that municipalities should have more tools to procure and tap into private capital and expertise, not fewer. And it's for this reason that the Council established the Municipal Engagement Advisory Group, which is made up of both public and private sector members who have experience with the P3 model and with P3 models generally. This group has played a key role in developing our recent municipal recommendations and also a P3 guide for municipalities, which several MEAG members who are participating today were part of, and others will be facilitating episodes for this webinar series, including today. Just a quick housekeeping note before we begin. We'll be taking questions during the webinar presentation and also at the end of the event. So in the event you wish to submit any questions as we're going through, please submit them at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll attempt to answer them as we're proceeding, or we'll answer them at the end of the webinar when questions can also be raised. With that, I'd like to mention, if I could, and focus your attention on the digital tools that the Council has put together as municipal guidance tools as a companion to this webinar series. You can download the municipal guidance digital tools, which contain the latest information on procurement models, best practices, and new mini case studies. You can do that by accessing them through the QR code or by clicking the links in the chat. So we encourage you to do so during or after the webinar series. There are some considerable resources there that we think you'll find very helpful to elaborate on what you hear today and other topics of interest related to the to P3s generally. I'd now like to introduce our facilitators for today. I'm very pleased to do so, and to do so in particular because each of them bring exceptional expertise and leadership in the P3 and infrastructure sectors to the discussion today. First of all, we have Tracy Kyle, who is the Director of Engineering and Public Works for the City of Mission in BC. Tracy is the Director of Engineering and Public Works, where she has led both infrastructure planning and service delivery for over a decade, and has more than 30 years of experience in municipal engineering. And she's also had senior roles in Coquitlam, Vancouver, Kamloops, and Abbotsford, and is a UBC trained professional engineer. And she's committed to building sustainable and inclusive communities through collaboration and innovation. Welcome, Tracy. And then we also have next Chris Barrow, who's the Managing Director in PwC's Real Assets Practice. He's based out of Toronto. He has more than 15 years of experience advising on major capital projects, Originally from the UK, Chris has advised federal, provincial, and municipal governments on structuring innovative commercial arrangements, as well as advising contractors, lenders, and investors. And he's also advised multiple municipalities on projects in various sectors that include assets in water, wastewater, transportation, waste management, and social infrastructure. Chris, I'd now like to invite Chris to set the context for today's episode. Welcome, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And thank you, everyone, for joining the session today. I think the intention today is hopefully we build on the 4 previous episodes in this series and continue to explore how the P3 model can be adapted and used most effectively in the municipal setting. As Tom's already mentioned, very much welcome questions, comments, observations as we go through the session today. I recognise the attendees of this call have plenty of real-life experiences, and at C2P3, it really is invaluable to get those shared and understand how we can learn from each other and how we can tackle things in a sort of manner that's beneficial for everyone across the industry. When we're looking at the sort of learning objectives today, we are wanting to step through, I think, 3 or 4 different topics as we go through, and they will build and we'll jump backwards and forwards a little bit as we go. So 1, understanding the role of external advisors. 2, talking through some of the municipal capacity challenges. 3, looking at some best practices for how to establish sort of a project team and engaging advisors. And then I think most critically, how do we apply all the P3 sort of concepts, language, literature to real world cases and things that actually are being lived, being delivered, and how we share those experiences. I think everyone probably is aware that the council has recently published the P3 guide for municipalities. So today's content really looks to expand some of the material that's in chapters 6, 7, and 9. And so hopefully this all comes together, but really do welcome questions and comments as we go through. If we go on to the next slide, we're going to start talking through sort of this our rough roadmap of how we're going to spend the next sort of 80 minutes or so. We'll start with talking through some of the municipal P3 challenges, move on to how maybe we've seen municipalities most effectively engage with expert advisors, talk through some of the implications and considerations of how to set up the right team and advocates, and then Tracy will spend some time talking through a case study about how we've seen all these different concepts come together, what's worked well, and I think equally importantly, where we've got lessons learned and how do we take those lessons learned, but see them as a way that actually, yes, there's a feedback loop, there's also opportunities that come out of that, and there is a depth and breadth of knowledge across Canadian municipalities that we can use to help structure, deliver, and make the P3 model effective, if it is the model that an individual municipality chooses to use. So we're going to spend probably the next 10 minutes or so talking through some of the different municipal barriers to P3 success. And again, the content that we're sharing today has been very much informed by the work that the Municipal Engagement Group at the C2P3 have done over the last 6-9 months to understand and establish what is it we're seeing as the real barriers to P3 successes, to delivering P3 successfully across Canada, that we very much see the opportunity that the P3 model has, and have some very strong examples of where that P3 model has enabled infrastructure to be delivered that otherwise maybe wouldn't be delivered, or been delivered in a more innovative or better value manner. We also recognise that the P3 model has a number of challenges when we look at it, particularly within a municipal setting. So we wanted to sort of start maybe debunking some of those or stepping through some of those. So again, if people are looking at the P3 delivery model, they're going in informed. We're starting to talk through and recognise there are challenges, and we're starting to think about how some of those can be planned for, mitigated, and addressed. So based on the work that the C2P3 Municipal Advisory Group, Engagement Group carried out, the 5 sort of main themes were identified that were specific to municipalities when looking at the P3 model. So again, I recognise in some of the previous sessions, people have stepped through already some of the key challenges on the P3 model generally. So here we're really trying to focus on what is it that's common to municipalities when we compare, for instance, to P3 being delivered either federally or provincially. And I say 5 main themes came through. We'll talk through a few of them in a little bit more detail over the coming slides, but really we wanted to step through those as a starting point, and then we'll unpick as we go. So firstly, sort of P3s are more complicated than typical contracting arrangements. While P3s are far from new now, and they've been established in the market for more than 20 years, they still are seen as unusual, and things that are unusual often obviously attract additional scrutiny and additional reviews. So there's specific challenges around the legislative and regulatory framework we have with P3s. Municipalities obviously operate within varying provincial regulations. Some of those provincial regulations support P3 delivery more or less. And there's also a piece around how do you manage policy across municipalities, and we'll come back to that in a second. Also recognise that P3s have a number of features that mean they have to compete with other infrastructure priorities. So typically a P3 procurement and delivery model takes more time up front to design, to procure and to implement than maybe other forms of delivery models, so traditional delivery or other forms of contracting. There's also a piece with P3s where their very nature means you're looking to make long-term financial commitments, usually as part of that P3 structure. So whether that's through a multi-year construction phase, if you're using a design build finance model, or as we often see, looking at a whole of life approach or 25, 30-year approach with a design build finance, operate, maintain type model, there are significant budgetary implications that come with using P3s. And we recognise that every municipality across Canada is really having to grapple with a number of competing infrastructure priorities. We recognise there's more and more infrastructure that's aging. Budget constraints continue to be very challenging. Significant backlog maintenance is a typical feature we see across our municipality clients, and also recognising that there can often be other policy initiatives or incentives that require action to happen very quickly. So particularly at the moment, the activity around how do we deliver more homes faster, that can lead to pressure to try and deliver and put in place delivery models that get shovels in the ground as quickly as possible. And there's a need to try and manage, how do we look at the different models that are there and recognise there are competing infrastructure priorities. P3s have some challenges, and any plan that involves a municipality using a P3 will need to think through how does it manage and resource that P3 relative to the other parts of its portfolio. Third point we've got on the page is really around limited financial capacity. Again, we'll unpick that a little bit more in a moment, but I'm preaching to people who very much live with this on a day-by-day basis. Municipal revenue sources obviously restricted, large number of competing demands, both within the sort of infrastructure, real assets part of the municipality, but also with other services, many of which can be seen as having a higher impact or higher political priority. So real need to try and navigate, how do you structure a P3 that respects the position of municipalities in Canada? Fourth factor on this page, looking at knowledge and experience gaps. So recognizing P3s aren't things that I think any municipality in Canada is doing on a week-by-week basis. Even the largest municipalities that have a number of P3s, they tend to be things that are done once every 12 months, 18 months, 24 months. And even when I've worked on P3s globally, I've had whole countries that have done one P3 every 3 years or something like that. So worked in Norway, one P3 was done every 3 years. And the challenge they had was everyone who knew something about that P3 had a bit significant piece of knowledge and upskilling. And then by the time the second project came along, much of that knowledge had moved on, or there was a challenge around, how do you adapt and how does that come through? And I think that knowledge and experience gaps is particularly relevant at the moment, because as people have talked through in some of the earlier sessions in this series, the world of P3 has been changing. There's been a significant move to sort of progressive or collaborative P3 models, a bit more of a move away from fixed price type approaches. So again, even if people have had significant experience of working on P3s in the past, we're seeing that there's more and more change happening in the market, and actually experience from even 3-5 years ago is increasingly needing to be updated and refreshed to meet the current market conditions. And then probably the final one here is at the bottom of the page, and there's probably an argument that maybe it should be at the top of the page, but really around the public misconceptions and some of the approaches that can come with P3s and the response from political members and from the public. So in particular, we find there's a lot of uncertainty around P3s and a lot of assumptions that often the public has around P3 models. In particular, there tends to be a presumption that P3 is equivalent to privatization. So there's often a lot of time needed to try and debunk and explain, look, the P3 model generally does not involve transfer of ownership. Ownership is retained by the municipality. It just involves the private sector service provider delivering services and doing those in a certain way and potentially taking on certain risks. But the municipality remains the ultimate owner, ultimate party that's responsible for overseeing and delivering those services. And there's also significant sort of implications from a P3 perspective in terms of labour impacts. So again, a number of examples, and I think Tracy will expand on some of these later, where there's been significant pushback, particularly from unionised labour, but potentially across all the different labour groups, around what might the implications of a P3 be. And again, I think some of those have had some challenges about what does the rhetoric say versus the underlying facts and key points, and needing to manage to work through how that gets navigated and balancing the need to consult and engage with all the different parties involved in delivering a P3 successfully, with avoiding a process where you're effectively crippled from the start and you get to a point where you're just not able to get that momentum going, or it's the project faces challenge at every turn and you actually lose momentum and the ability to deliver a P3 effectively. If we go on to the next slide, then we'll just drill down into a few of those in a little bit more detail. And again, say always welcome questions or comments as we go through. So the legislative framework and policy considerations. P3s are a sort of a different type of beast in the way that the contract works and the way that sometimes the different policy decision-making needs to work and needs to function in order to deliver a P3 effectively. So generally, and I recognise we've sort of said this as a statement, but I think we're comfortable this is true across Canada, but municipalities have authority to enter into P3 contracts, but that is governed by provincial laws. So we do see there's some differences across the provinces, but generally there's the ability to enter into those P3 contracts. You'll then need to navigate through how much wider policy and procurement frameworks impact the delivery of the P3. And one of the challenges we often get with P3s is they are very different from conventional policy and procurement frameworks. It may well be you've got a standard framework that makes some assumption that you're going to use, for instance, one of the CCDC contracts, your standard contracting model. Well, how does that get adapted to a P3 piece, and how does that work through? And there is a need for municipalities both to assess whether local regulations permit alternative procurement methods, so both sort of what does the regulation allow, but as importantly, how do you get consensus and buy-in that the P3 procurement is the right way to go from a policy perspective? So again, each municipality needs to think about its own procurement policies, align those with wider requirements around things like community engagement, stakeholder consultation, and then look at how does that all come together to deliver a procurement policy that makes sense and that's actually deliverable and achievable. And I really do stress some of these points because I think we've had a number of examples where municipalities have started down the P3 route. They've gone as far potentially as issuing an RFP to the market, and then the project has effectively fallen over because there hasn't been either the policy and legislative framework in place, or more often there just hasn't been that consensus in place around the project, the delivery model, and the overall approach. And what we're seeing as a consequence of that is that potential bidders on P3 opportunities are becoming increasingly skeptical about whether they are devoting time and resource to bidding for P3 opportunities, particularly with municipalities, unless they have real clarity around the policy position, a degree of certainty, and a degree of permanence to that approach. So it is something to think about, both from how do you navigate it internally, but increasingly, if you are going to use the P3 approach, how do you manage to attract sufficient bidders to run a competitive process and to make sure you're managing to extract best value and approach from the market. I think a couple of final points on observation on this slide. Small municipalities can lack the resources quite often. So there are large municipalities that have more experience of P3s. And so Edmonton, Calgary, and Ottawa I mentioned there. I'd also observe that actually, while size of municipality can be a driver of sort of use of P3 or not, actually, quite often it's been the people at the municipality themselves and some of the decision-making municipality. So it doesn't really track that explicitly always. Look, size of municipality means more P3 experience. So there are really strong pockets of really strong experienced individuals and good practice. They exist across municipalities of all size across the country. So again, there are different sources of information and different routes available to help navigate those pieces. And obviously throughout, there needs to be the focus on transparency, accountability, and value for money, but also recognizing that P3 procurement often involves multiple stages. Maybe we'll have some negotiations that need to happen. If there's private finance coming in, there'll be a set of negotiations with the private finance and the lender community. So yes, it's obviously imperative that transparency, accountability, and value for money are at the center of everything, but needing to balance that with how do you deliver a process that's commercially effective, and how do you manage that in a way that doesn't mean you have large gaps as you go through approval cycles and looking at the overall process and approach. The slide we've got here then just delves a little bit more deeply into the financial constraints that can impact municipalities when looking at P3 approaches. Again, I recognize people on this call and this webinar are probably very familiar with many of these. It is true when we look at P3s and how are they most effective, really looking at long-term financial planning, looking at whole of life or certainly early life costs that takes into account operations and maintenance costs, and making sure that's thought through from the outset. So particularly making sure if we are spending significant amounts of money building a new asset, there needs to be budget in place to operate and maintain that effectively, and to look at how that will be used sustainably into the medium term. We recognise this all comes against the challenges that municipalities face around revenue generation and borrowing. So particularly municipalities relying on property tax as a revenue source. P3 service payments need to be sustainable within municipal budgets. There's a challenge that often that the P3 payments become contractualized sums that then are effectively fixed on an ongoing basis. So once those sums are sort of agreed, it is very difficult to reduce down those sums. So compared to other lines in the municipal budget, it's very difficult to find savings in those lines once sort of contractual commitments have been made. And there is a wider piece here again, looking at how does borrowing limits work and how do they restrict the ability potentially to finance large infrastructure projects. We're seeing more and more that, again, different regulations across the country, but for instance in Ontario, greater use of things like municipal services corporations or different models that try and get different investments outside debt caps. But again, need to look at, is the investment sustainable? How does that work through? And maybe just unpicking again the property tax piece, recognize there's different approaches across the country to how certain types of assets are funded. But if I take, for instance, water, wastewater, in many places that's funded on an accrual basis. That causes various challenges around when is an asset being delivered versus who has paid for that asset. How do you time the procurement with the development of sufficient reserves and accrual balances? So really need to manage each of those different dynamics and recognizing that yes, P3s can help with given some certain positions around future cost certainty, future risk transfer, but they also do introduce some complexities around when might funds be required, the timing of the procurement, and other pieces that come in. So we very much see financial challenges being addressed, potentially through bundling strategies. So particularly for small municipalities, grouping projects together. So taking, for instance, a bundle of school assets or accommodation assets, office facilities together can help make small projects more viable. Really a critical one here is exploring alternative revenue sources where feasible. And I recognise saying the phrase alternative revenue sources sounds like a very nice thing for me to sit here and say today. Practically, there's obviously far more constraints that kick in. But we are seeing that sometimes those P3s that are going forward and being successful, they either needed to look at what are the additional revenue sources that may come in from other non-municipal routes, or increasingly looking at, is there some way that, for instance, again, we're using water wastewater as an example, but the charging model potentially adapts, or the overall approach adapts, so that you aren't just looking at how do I deliver this capital project, you're looking at how do I put in place a revenue model that's more sustainable going forwards. And then the final point here that we consistent throughout this is really making sure when we're looking at how do P3s deliver their benefits best, looking at that operations and maintenance phase as well, making sure that's being considered in value for money assessments and captured in budgetary planning. So again, trying to tackle the whole of life cost, looking at that as a single holistic manner, and trying to avoid a position where you end up with new assets and backlog maintenance challenges that then just exacerbate and run on from there. I'll step through this slide relatively quickly because I think we touched on this pretty much on sort of one of the earlier slides. We recognize P3s are changing, they're evolving, they're taking on new forms. So even some of the, for instance, the provincial agencies that spend or have spent a lot of their time over the last 10, 15 years delivering P3s, they're having to adapt. So Infrastructure Ontario has delivered tens of P3s each year, but they're finding they're having to change the skills and experience they need at the moment for how the market's evolving. So we've got that sort of evolution of the P3 model, plus alongside that be the fact that a P3 for a municipality tends to be a relatively unusual event. There can be a limited level of in-house P3 expertise, and there's then things that need to be thought through around how do you make sure you do structure a team that has the right level of skills, experience, and knowledge, that you are managing each of the different risks appropriately, and you're avoiding a position where you're having to interface with bidders who are doing P3s on a week-by-week basis, and you've got an imbalance there between sort of the skills that sit with the owner at the municipality and those that sit with your contractors on the other side of the table. And that's as valid during the procurement phase as it is during the sort of delivery and then the contract management piece, needing to make sure that the owner can sit there, is able to stand their ground and sit there opposite contractors in an informed and well-resourced manner. Some of the solutions that are noted here, obviously leveraging provincial P3 frameworks. If there's a model that's being used by the province in a certain part of the country, that often is a very good starting point. The market understands it. The province has developed it for a specific reason. Yes, it may require some adaptation, but starting with something and adapting is far easier than starting with a blank piece of paper. So think about what can be adapted from existing sources, and then look at the C2, P3 resources that also exist and the guidance that's available. And we'll come back to some of the other points here around how do you set up your team and external advisors in the next section. And then I think this is the final slide we've got in this specific piece, really around right-sizing P3s. And I think there's, over the last 20 years plus, there's been a debate about sort of what is the right size of a P3 project and a P3 contract. And that comes from a few different angles. So here in particular, we focus on sort of project size versus procurement costs. So it is, I think, fair to say that P3s cost more to procure in the upfront period than traditional delivery models. So alternative procurement methods generally have some additional costs that come in, and there's a need to think through what type of projects best justify those costs, and how do those costs then get effectively recovered through the whole of life and from a value for money perspective. But also recognise that a large portion of the transaction costs of a P3 are effectively fixed, however large that P3 project is. And even from a sort of a personal perspective, I do pretty much the same amount of work on a $1 billion project as I do on a $10 million project. So lots of those tasks are the same, they're very similar. And so you do find there's a real economy of scale, and larger projects are more easily able to absorb procurement costs and still demonstrate value for money. Infrastructure Ontario provides a good data point. They recommend P3 projects only for projects over 100 million. I recognise in the current sort of inflationary environment of construction, 100 million doesn't get you a huge amount these days from a project cost perspective, but it is that type of level we probably expect projects to be at before a P3 delivery model would typically make sense. Obviously, there will be specific situations and specific approaches that make sense in certain contexts. As a general rule of thumb, that sort of 100 million sort of guidance sits there. And one thing we do encourage is that if there are opportunities for municipalities to bundle projects, either internally or with neighbouring municipalities, that can often give you a really strong economy of scale that helps pass the costs over a wider capital base. It also helps make the project more effective and attractive to the market as well. We've now got a short section just talking through some of the expert guidance that when we looked at how P3 is being delivered most effectively, the C2P3 group identified, look, these are potential ways you can unlock P3 potential in the best manner possible. And I also do recognise there's a slight hypocrisy almost as I deliver this section, given I work for PwC and act as a financial and transaction advisor on P3s. So hopefully I won't show too many biases as we go through this, but this will help just socialise what we're seeing, how things have been structured to deliver successfully, and what that might mean if you're thinking about approaching a P3 project. So I think it's probably fair to say that 98+% of P3s that have been delivered, whether federally, provincially, or at municipal level in Canada, have had external advisors involved to support the delivery. And again, that really does reflect that even where we've got some of the larger procuring authorities, they still need a degree of expert support on some parts of the P3 process. So they look to get that advisory experience as we go through. I think when we look at municipal level, external advisors have potentially additional roles to play. So again, they can provide that essential expertise in P3 projects. They help provide information about the latest changes in the market, latest developments, and say the market has been changing a lot over the last 24 months. So we are seeing look, what would have worked 6 months ago wouldn't work as well now, need to adapt and look at a new path for success. There's also a piece here of recognising municipal resources are often constrained. There's a limited number of people available. So there's an approach to be and a decision to be made at the outset about what are the municipal resources available to support a project, what's needed to make sure the project's effectively staffed and resourced, and how then does that sort of get delivered effectively, and is it an approach where you're looking for knowledge transfer to take place, upskilling, developing more capacity so the municipality can increasingly take on more the responsibilities, or in some instances we're seeing actually municipalities will look for that piece to be more of a service provider outsourced delivery model in some of these areas, because that's what's best for a municipality in their specific situations. And again, there's economies of scale that can kick in from there. And I think the involvement and role of external advisors, if we think of the P3 life cycle being at least 5-6 years, even in a design build finance, and if you add in the O&M phase to that, 15-20 years, different points where things ramp up, ramp down, different expertise you'll need, different skill sets. I think we've probably touched on some of this already as we've gone through, but really when sort of the why engage external advisors, it is looking for that specialized, unbiased expertise. P3s are different. If you open up a project agreement for a typical P3 project agreement for the first time, having never seen one before, I think you immediately actually sort of you feel a bit lost and potentially a bit of panic. When you're opening up one for the 20th, 30th time, it's a very different approach to that. So there are advantages to having that unbiased expertise that can come in, the ability to leverage people who are working across the P3 market on a week-by-week basis, and also looking at how do you manage to give reassurance to decision makers and approvers that you're tackling things in a way that's prudent and appropriate. So again, really thinking through objective insights, thinking about knowledge transfer, and then strategic support. So again, I find some municipalities, they are effectively looking for almost what I call some subject matter experts who sort of sit there and they answer questions or get involved in very specific technical considerations. Whereas some of the municipalities have an approach where actually they're looking for potentially external advisors to project manage and deliver the whole of the process. And there's pros and cons of each. It'll depend slightly on internal resource and capability about which model makes sense for each project in each municipality. Here we've got sort of a list of the different external advisor roles that's often seen during that sort of planning and procurement. And I think we'll probably focus on planning and procurement mostly, I think, in the next couple of slides. So really that project sort of inception stage, really the point you've sort of agreed the project makes sense, you're looking at P3 as the potential delivery model, but what is it you might need in terms of those external advisor roles? And I think there's 7 different roles listed out here. I think often some of these roles are sort of combined into a single mandate, or they can be split up as they are as shown here. But effectively, you're looking at external advisors across multiple disciplines. So if you are looking for someone to assist from a project management perspective, project manager, someone, and a big observation, a P3 project, certainly once it gets into procurement, needs a dedicated project manager. It is a very difficult role to be tacked on to someone's existing day job. The risk advisor, so someone who supports in developing the risk frameworks, looks at managing the risk register and the mitigation strategies. Third one here around design consultant, technical advisor. So this is often one of the more substantive roles, but someone who provides that technical expertise and input around design, evaluation, regulatory compliance, necessarily thinking about permitting and other parts. Financial advisor, so look at the financial model, commercial approach, VFM assessment. Legal advisor, so again, establishing, drafting the contracts, supporting on the procurement documentation. Fairness monitor, obviously depends slightly on the procurement policies and the overall approach of each municipality, but we often see fairness monitors. And then cultural liaison or other advisors who focus more on how does any Indigenous engagement take place effectively, how are opportunities for Indigenous economic participation incorporated into the P3 model, and how might those be delivered most successfully. Once we get to the operational phase, we typically see that P3 sort of designer team slim down. So more of a focus at this point on performance management, auditing and compliance, payment mechanism oversight, and contract adjustments. So I think if you've got a P3 that's into the operations phase, it's all gone smoothly, there's nothing major happening, it usually is quite a lean team that's required. There still is a team required, though, to make sure the assets being maintained to the right performance standards. If there are a payment mechanism terms, you're applying them appropriately. And then the other piece to keep an eye on is if there are more challenges coming on along the lines of either from a project performance perspective or potentially one of your contractors' financial position has changed, making sure you're responding to that. You've got the external expertise needed so that if there is something that's causing more of a challenge, you've got the ability to respond, you're on the front foot, and you're not having to play catch up. And then sort of in terms of best practice for engaging advisors, I think these are probably relatively straightforward and understood, but look for competitive processes. Generally, that's the right approach to take. There are a number of existing vendor records that exist, both in provincial level, potentially municipality level, and potentially and across different levels of the public sector. So there may well be an existing vendor record that works well. It helps navigate some of the terms and conditions and gives you standards of approach and starting point. Matching expertise to project needs, I think that's obviously very important that there are different types of projects that exist and different types of procurements. So it's important you get an advisor and an advisory team that fits well for yourselves. And there is a piece here to think about, look, do you procure each of those advisors separately, or do you group some of them together and look, you go out to the market going, look, I want one bidder to come back who's going to deliver 3 or 4 of my different scopes of work. And it's for the bidders and the market to decide how do they group and which organizations they bring together to potentially partner to respond to any procurement process. And then say ongoing evaluation. So it is important you look at how do you demonstrate value for money from your advisors. They are a key part of the process. We typically find but also need to make sure you're getting effective advice. And look, if that position changes, it is relatively easy to replace advisors and look at different approaches if that's what makes sense in a specific situation. And then final sort of section before I pass over to Tracy is just touching a bit again on building the right P3 team and advocates within the municipality. I'd say, I was about to say 90%, maybe that's a little high, but I'd say of P3 projects that get to a challenging position, particularly before they get to procurement or during the procurement process, often the biggest challenge has been, look, are the right resources in place and have the right advocates been identified to help navigate the way through. So a strong project team matters, I think, is probably the main takeaway I'd take from this particular slide. So the right team for the right project. And that is going to mean, if you're trying to deliver a complicated transit system that requires the integration of stations, electrical, signalling, rolling stock, civil works, that is going to need a different approach than if you've got you're looking at a P3 that's more single asset, or it's a water main, or it's less technically complicated. But either of those models, you still do need that strong project team. Having the skilled internal team is critical, particularly as the projects have got more complicated. It's important to make sure you can sit there and operate effectively opposite bidders and the market, both to make sure you're getting the best value for yourselves and for the taxpayers, but also to make sure you're actually demonstrating to the market, look, we understand and we know what we're doing. You need to meet the obligations you're signing up to. You need to treat us appropriately. And if you don't, we will be in a position where we respond and intervene as appropriate. So really important to think very carefully about what does that project team look like. And that project team needs to think as well, and sort of at the inception stage of a project, think about how that will change over time. So from planning and procurement piece through to contract award, operations. And it's always a bit scary, but we're increasingly seeing projects getting closer and closer to handback. So when you get to the end of P3 concession in 25 years, for instance, look, what's going to happen at that handback piece? I think probably the couple of pieces I'd highlight on the rest of this slide is looking at how you make sure you've got sufficient resource. So team members need to be able to dedicate sufficient time to a P3 to be able to deliver their roles effectively. There will be some people who will need to be full-time, probably on the P3 procurement piece for a period of time, and there'll be others who are needed to support the P3 piece. But one of the biggest challenges with P3 projects is there's not an inability to access right resource on a timely basis. That causes delays, it adds cost, it makes bidders frustrated, it makes political approvers frustrated. So really making sure there's the right resource available with the right skill sets available to be accessed when needed. Jump to the next slide. Yep, great. So role of local government in the P3 project team. Again, I think we've probably touched on nearly all of these pieces we've gone through, but the municipal acts, obviously, are the starting point here. They define what's needed from a sort of a statutory perspective, and then that then can be overlaid with what's required at a local level and from a policy and approval perspective. There may be some requirement for public consultation, needing to think through how that's managed, where that's scheduled, and how you do that in a way that avoids having sort of dead time in the project. So how is that used effectively? Where do you get the public consultation, and how do you sort of manage the implications of that? Structuring the approval process, I think that's really, really key. How do you build up the approvals? How do you look at what can be delegated potentially to allow some approvals at a local level? And how do you structure that approval process effectively? Regular council updates, obviously, people on this call will have plenty of experience with how to best manage councillors, but keeping decision makers informed, making sure that the decision makers understand the risks and complexities that come from a P3. So there are benefits, but there are also challenges. Looking at how those are being monitored and mitigated as you go through, and a transparent framework that, again, helps build confidence in the municipality's procurement process, both from an internal governance piece, but also to attract high quality bids from the market. And I think we're pretty much at the end of this piece, but final sort of note on collaborative procurement models. Collaborative procurement models, as people who've attended some of the previous sessions will be aware, have many benefits, and we're seeing them more and more coming into the Canadian P3 market. And really, those collaborative procurement models may, for some types of projects, be the only type of contractual or commercial model that the market, as it stands today, is willing to accept. So they're going to come up more and more frequently, but also I'd say collaborative procurement models are still emerging. So there's some pockets of really strong practice, and there's pockets of where things really have struggled to navigate collaborative approaches effectively. So collaborative procurement does typically have more upfront costs, so greater time is spent on the design, on the planning for the project. The intent, and where done well, is that it actually helps lower cost over the long term. So by doing more work collaboratively upfront, you take down some of the bid costs that you have if you have multiple bidders working across multiple solutions, and you also take down the amount of risk and contingency the bidders are having to price in. You allow for more pragmatic approach to contracting. You allow for more tailored delivery approach. So collaborative procurement models really do have plenty of benefits that can come through around risk management, cost savings and efficiency, particularly thinking about early contractor involvement, potential improved project outcomes, and allows you to really think about, look, what are innovative solutions? So, and how, for instance, maybe do you best engage First Nations or other parts of the overall delivery strategy? So you'll see the collaborative procurement models being talked about more and more. Everything we've said previously, I think, is still relevant, but there's an extra sort of layer that kicks in for those particular structures. And then just touching very quickly on the role of political and administrative advocates in P3 success. I think the key takeaway I'd say here is P3s, particularly at municipal level, really, really need advocates who are willing to champion them, both in council and within the administration. So I think if you're looking at a P3 process, think through what is that approach, who's the right person to help secure both political buy-in and public support, and also looking at it from an administrative piece and stay as that link point into the CAO or the CFO's office as well. So really important to think about early on, strong advocates that helps again mitigate some of the challenges we see with P3 projects where you get delays or misalignment or challenge on public trust. So leadership really is key. Think about it at the outset and plan for it from the start. And I think that is sort of the end of the content that I was going to present today. Obviously, again, more than happy to have questions and discussion at the end of the session today. I'm going to now pass over to Tracy, who's going to share some case studies and observations based on her experience.
Thanks, Chris. I just wanted to thank you all for joining, and I'll hop right into a case study for a project that I worked on. In the early 2000s, the communities of Abbotsford and Mission were running out of water. During peak periods, the water system was becoming precariously close to reaching its capacity. Both the communities served by that region were growing very fast and continue to grow fast. And the existing water sources were expected to reach their capacity within the coming years. There were several things that were undertaken, all in parallel. There was metering, conservation efforts, increased tier rate structures. There was optimization of the existing water system to try to get as much water through it as possible, worked on water loss. But the main component of what the communities were doing was looking at a new water source, which was needed to take it into the future. What was landed on through several years of studies was a water source in Stave Lake, which is a local lake up in the mountains. The costs at that time was about $300 million for this project, which included water intake in Stave Lake, a pump station, a treatment plant, and many kilometers of large diameter water mains, which would connect the water source to the existing network of water mains. This project was initially embarked on thinking that it would be more traditional procurement models that the communities have done in the past for other projects. But in the end, they landed on a P3 model. The model would have the private partner designing, building, partially financing, and operating the treatment facility itself over a 25-year term. The ownership would remain with the region, and the operations would be shared. So the partner would only be operating the new water treatment plant itself and the intake. In 2011, the federal government, through the P3 Canada Fund, approved $65.7 million grant for this project, which was a very good a news story at the time. Because of BC laws for municipalities, there needed to be electorate assent for the project on two aspects. One, for borrowing the capital that was needed, as well as entering into a long-term agreement with the P3 partner. There was a requirement to get that assent, and because there was an upcoming municipal election scheduled, the decision was made to do that referendum at the same time as the municipal election in 2011. And that's really where things started to unravel for this project. I think my presentation has a lot of takeaways from a project that's failed. And I think, some great points to consider if you are looking at going with a P3 model. There are also a lot of projects that have gone very well and are operating that have went through this model. For example, the Winnipeg wastewater treatment plant. And there are some case studies for that on the website that you can look at if you want to get more information on that. For this project itself, in Abbotsford and Mission, there was a few contributors that played into it not going well and the downfall of that project. Next slide. One was the limited municipal funding capacity. At the time, Abbotsford and Mission, they really didn't have the financial capacity to deliver a huge project on this scale on their own financially. And as I mentioned, they weren't initially looking at the P3 model, but went that route, and a large part of that was the grant opportunity that came along with going through the P3 model. Another part of the downfall was the regulatory framework in BC, which required electorate assent for both the borrowing as well as the long-term agreement. And with this electorate assent, coordinated with the municipal election, it really threw this project, which was incredibly complex on many fronts, into the public arena, where it became subject to a really heightened political and public attention. During the election, there were many people that wanted to, get council seats in both communities, running for mayor. And all of these people were speaking about this project that they had little to no knowledge about. And so there was a lot of misinformation out there because of that. Another factor was public misconception. So we had this project that there was a whole lot of misinformation out there because it was happening in coordination with a municipal election. And the timing, because of that, if it had been able to do it separately away from a municipal election, there probably wouldn't have been that heightened political kind of opportunistic communication efforts by, so many different people. And as a result, there was a real lack of trust of, who was giving the right information. And that was an issue that became very apparent. And at the end result, it was the referendum, did not pass, and that project for Stave Lake has still never went forward. Next slide. So even though this project had really strong technical merit, it had strong senior level of government support, it had strong support from municipalities. The municipalities, as Chris had talked about, kind of building that team. There were external advisors from financial perspective, from communications, technical expertise, legal. They were all brought on. As well, the municipality had seconded internal staff. Basically taken everything off their plate and seconded them to have time to focus on this effort. So I think from that perspective, everything was done right. And it was really, really strong project in that regard. So one of the, just taking a look at some of the key contributors to some of the challenges, I'll go into those a little bit more detail. The referendum question itself, it was a full page question. And so we had residents of all walks of life reading this full page technical referendum question that was drafted by a team of lawyers. And we made every effort to simplify it as much as possible, but it had to have certain things mentioned to be workable to move this project forward. And it was just really complex. And for most people, they saw it, they didn't even know how to respond. So it's like, yeah, no, I don't know what to do here. So it was a multi question referendum. It was, should we borrow $220 million? Should we pursue a 30-year P3 model? Should we proceed with the Stave Lake source? There was just a lot of weight in these questions, and as you can imagine, it was very complex for the average resident that probably didn't even know where we got our water at currently. They didn't have a lot of education on the water system itself. Another factor was, I had mentioned that the municipalities were, really diving into conservation, optimizing the water system, putting in meters, changing to inclining block rate structure. So there was a lot of things happening at once in the water realm. And I think a lot of residents were concerned that they didn't exactly understand how the referendum tied with those things, what that meant for paying for water. Is it going to continue to be, affordable? And once again, it provided an opportunity for everyone that was opposed to this project to feed into that. There were some other past projects at the city, kind of large scale projects that in the past hadn't maybe gone the way that residents had wanted. And so there was a bit of concern from residents about that project and those past projects, and if this was, something that was going to, kind of continue down a similar path. They were concerned that maybe they weren't being given the full picture and they were going to learn about something after. So there was a bit of a trust issue as well. One of the really big factors was the opposition. As I mentioned, there was an election, so there was a lot of people that wanted to be elected that were speaking about this project and didn't know a lot about it. but there was also a very concerted effort by unions. And, I think both communities had really strong relationships with their unions. But there was a national effort, kind of that focused in on this project. And so QP National, there was a Water Watch group. There was a lot of effort and probably funding that went into kind of opposing this project. And so they got messaging out that, water was for life, not for profit, really easy kind of taglines that residents understood. Whereas, the information that we were giving was complex, different kinds of procurement, very complex. And so it was easier to listen to and understand, water for life, not for profit. That made sense to a lot of people. And so, they were able to cut through the complexity of the project and really resonated with the voters in what they were saying. Another aspect of, what may have gone sideways in this was there was some some skepticism in residents with, the community's long-term interest, the financial risk, that was coming with this. This was a large amount of money for the communities. And so there was, just a lot of skepticism and concern just with a lot of the bigger issues with this project. So some key takeaways would be, when there is complex messaging and some organized opposition that's happening all at once, communication is key. And, I do think they did have a great communications consultant and a strong communications team. But the timing and everything made it really hard to get that message out there in a way that was meaningful. And so that's something really important to consider. Next slide. So just some key takeaways. Complex projects require clear communication. And, just to avoid confusion any way you can, when a project involves multiple decisions like this one with financing and governance and service delivery, every single one of those elements need to communicate it in a way that's very simple and very direct and very easy to understand. And, that's no small feat to do that. If at all possible, get the referendum question, as simple as possible. And, I don't know if there are ways to do that, but that was a real big barrier, in this project itself. Timing, having the project happen in referendum happening with the municipal election. I would avoid that completely, have this project on its own and not having to compete, with, elections and other things that are happening. So how and when you introduce a project and bring it forward is a really critical part of how the success will roll out. And one of the last items, and not, very important, is don't underestimate the unionized context of something like this. There were, concerns about jobs, control, long-term governance. And so, although we had engaged, with our local union, there was a whole national element to it that, wasn't entirely anticipated to the level that it happened. And, being prepared for that is really important. And I guess another takeaway would be to look how the project is framed in the public realm. while the Stave Lake project, the infrastructure and the need was all very relevant and necessary, it was the way that was framed and the values. It probably didn't align with what the resident wanted for stewardship of our water resources, trust with a third party that was in it for profit. And so there's probably a need to kind of shift the mindset of the public and what they can trust, and know that the municipality or the regional district, or whoever it is, does have the best team together to pull this out. And I guess that's kind of my main takeaways. I think there was some good themes there, that if you are looking to move forward with a P3 project, take those into account, and hopefully you'll have a project that makes it through all the hurdles along the way. And that's all I had. If anyone, once again, if there's questions, we'll have time for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tracy. And actually, we do have some questions, but before I go to those, I just want to remind everybody that if you do have questions, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen where you can upload the question and we'll see them and we can respond. So I guess the first question really, Tracy, is for you. And it's really a question of whether you're aware of anyone revisiting or looking again at the Slave Lake discussion and potentially having a different outcome. Do you have any comments on that?
So the municipalities have decided to go with a different source of water, something that was more closer, a little bit more feasible, and the costs were as well lower, and that's the direction they're going at this time instead of this large project.
And I do have one other question, actually, which is probably for both of you, but maybe we'll start with you, Chris. There's a question about any comments you might make about how the P3 model has evolved, leaving aside collaborative models such as Alliance and so on. Can you elaborate a little more on how P3 models have evolved in recent years, having regard to the factors and the best practices that you mentioned?
Yeah, no, happy to start, and then I'm sure Tracy will have things to build on, because I think that's a pretty broad question and you probably get different answers from different people. Maybe if I start, I'd probably observe there's probably a period of time in the late 2000s through the 2010s when the real probably emphasis often in the P3 market was more towards standardization. So looking at how do we get more standardization in place? How does that allow us to replicate, take down transaction costs, and deliver potentially more quickly? I'd suggest over the last probably 5-6 years, we've sort of had a movement away again from that standardization to recognizing that each of these projects often are individual, they've got their bespoke requirements and challenges, and they need to make sure they're being looked at from an individual project context rather than trying to shoehorn them into a model that maybe isn't always the best for purpose. And I think there's probably a few sort of drivers for that. Probably main one of all is really looking at how so many projects we're seeing are just getting more and more complicated. The world of sort of a straightforward, medium, low complexity project sort of seems to be being lost, and we're looking and seeing far more high complexity projects or projects that require particular sort of approaches or angles or delivery models. I think then when we look at sort of how things have evolved, some of it's being driven very much by what's the bidder market and the funder market willing to take and sign up for. And we've seen both the main sort of construction contractors who are active in the P3 market, as well as a number of the equity providers and some of the senior debt providers being increasingly cautious about the P3 model, how they look at the risk appetite and how they look at different opportunities. And again, I think that's really coming from their lived experience, that they've often spent time bidding on projects, they've either not closed or they've won projects and then almost end up with winners remorse, where they've then found that they've struggled to deliver to the budget or they hadn't thought through the challenges of the other pieces. So I think that's really changed the dynamic between the owner and the market, and that's led to a number of changes around how do we need to engage with the market in different ways. So I think that includes actually you have to do far more work as a contracting authority or an owner to develop the market for your project. We are no longer in the world where put out an RFP and you'll get 3 bids coming back. We're seeing more and more cases where RFPs are getting 1 bid back, maybe sometimes 2, but very rarely more than that. So again, needing to think about how do we adapt our models that work best for the market and evolve in that way. And I think there's a piece as well of how has the P3 model evolved in terms of public perception and public consciousness over recent times. And I think that, again, people tend to focus on the examples that have had more challenge, some of those higher profile cases. So needing to, again, think about how do we evolve the model so that we're both looking at how do we build that consensus, but also making sure we're planning appropriately for how you manage and oversee through the construction period and into operations. And again, there's a plethora of lessons learned that have come out over the last 5-7 years, that when people were developing some of these contracts sort of back in the early 2010s, they hadn't anticipated the challenges, and we're getting that feedback loop working far more effectively. And again, that I think just helps some of these tools be far more tailored and effective and build on things to really establish and improve best practice.
Tracy, any comments on that question, on evolution of the P3 model over the years?
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to Chris's response. I think it was very thorough. I do think, as he said, over the past, decade, there has been a lot of, kind of learning that's happened, both with the, the projects that have been successful and those that haven't. And, I think that is probably, puts everyone in a better position now to have, some solid case studies. I think when we were embarking on it, there weren't as many projects that we could point to, as to highlight, success stories. And so, I think, kind of leaning into those would be a lot easier now than it was then.
And I just have a couple of comments, and then we can perhaps move into the wrap up on that question. I just building on what both Tracy and Chris have said. Certainly, the earlier sessions in this webinar series have some additional commentary that I would encourage anyone who's interested in this to review, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, how you can access that. But I would also just note, as Chris said, that the templating of projects still has a place, but there needs to be an analysis of whether the risk transfer is appropriate for a project and for a sector. And certainly over the years recently, we've seen a great deal more appetite on the part of authorities who are successful in truly examining what the risk transfer proposition is and whether the risk is allocated in the right way, and that is important for attracting proponents. It's also important for the success of the project and avoiding disputes. So in areas like geotechnical, in areas like permitting, we see a different risk allocation now than we used to see, and there are other examples I can give. And then we also have seen, and this is particularly important for municipalities, a greater initiative on the part of authorities often to de-risk projects before they actually launch, or at least explain that they will be de-risked by having, in some parts, by having early works or enabling works done in a way that doesn't try to put too much into the envelope of what the private partner is doing versus what can be done more effectively publicly. But I do want to encourage everyone who has an interest in that question to look at the webinar series records, and you will see on earlier on. And if you were not able to attend the sessions, you will see that some of this was touched on in some of the earlier sessions, and there could be some good information there, as well as in the tools which exist that I would like to turn to now. So we will wrap up just, if I could, with a few comments. One is about the digital tools that I mentioned at the beginning of the session. As indicated in this slide, there are tools that are available to echo what we've heard today and to expand on it, as well as to go into different areas that you may find of interest as you're looking at whether a P3 is the right way to go and also how to go about it. You can access those by clicking on that or focusing on that QR code. You can also go to the CCPPP website, and if you click on the research tab, which you'll find under what we do, you'll see, among other things, these resources. One of them speaks to what Tracy was dealing with. You talked to Tracy about the referendum that existed on the case study and how it wasn't successful. It's quite interesting to see how public perception has evolved about infrastructure needs and about public-private partnerships generally, and there's and that's very relevant as you're talking, as decision makers are looking at this at the municipal level, or you're talking to decision makers to look at the poll that the council did, that is one of the research items that talks about population growth and the need for P3s to meet infrastructure needs. It was released at the 2024 conference and has some very interesting findings that may be relevant as municipalities are considering P3s. And then we also have two very relevant resources that I mentioned earlier. One is entitled Empowering Municipalities, Unlocking the Potential of P3s. And then we, in addition, have a guide for municipalities, a P3 guide for municipalities that was put together by the group, the Municipal Engagement Advisory Group, with input from others, and includes the basics from this webinar series, as well as more details and more case studies. It was launched at the most recent seminar and was well received, and is a resource that could be turned to implement these ideas in your area or with your project. Next slide, please. Once again, I just want to offer a special thanks to our session sponsors, Amico, BLG, EPCOR, Fasken, Graham, and Mainline, whose generous support has helped to make this series possible. And the series on the next slide, as I indicated, had 6 sessions in it. This is our 5th session, and it is, and all of the sessions, as I mentioned, are available. We do look forward to seeing you all at our next session. We're taking a summer break, but on Tuesday, September 16th, our final episode will be aired and the topic will be engaging communities and stakeholders. It will be facilitated by Fraser McDonald, who's a principal at Strategy Corps, and Carrie Tewan, who's a director Director of Innovation, Technology, and Alternate Delivery at the Ontario Clean Water Agency. So we encourage you to circle that date of September 16th, Tuesday, September 16th, and join us for the last of our sessions in this series. As those who have signed up for this series, you will receive a calendar invite for the session, but please let us know if you have any challenges and reach out to the council if you need any assistance in accessing that resource. Finally, I just wanted to briefly mention, as you may have seen in your inbox, the conference which is coming up. The annual conference for 2025 is going to be held for the Canadian Council of Public-Private Partnerships on October 27th and 28th. Registration is now just opened for the infrastructure conference, and the program will contain sessions of special interest to municipalities, as well as panels, provocative panels on the the big ideas that the infrastructure sector is encountering. And a large focus will, of course, be on the priorities of the new federal government, which we've recently heard about and which we'll hear more about between now and then, and in particular at the conference, and how we can build out and support our infrastructure to bolster the Canadian economy and increase its resiliency and the resiliency of our communities to any challenges that exist or may lie ahead. So if you do have any questions or ideas or speaker suggestions, the council would welcome them. Otherwise, we very much look forward to seeing you on September 16th, and we thank you very much for joining us today.